After our meeting last week, I decided to work in a more deliberate way. That is, to consciously continue developing my projects, following the insights and questions as I came upon them and see where they led me. So, this week, for presenting, I've divided my work into a series of parts. I started out by experimenting with the acrylic and wood that I had in the studio. My next photography assignment is based around using the color combinations RGB and CMY, so I used the former combination as a starting point. Somewhere along the way, I was experimenting with the blue acrylic. It struck me that I was also working with blue pine. Blue pine is a term used to describe wood that has been infected and essentially killed by the blue pine beetle. I wondered how I might exaggerate the situation, the color, the light. I continued experimenting with blue and also red and green. I used both lumber and an uncut log. Nothing was particularly interesting to me, so I took a step back. I wondered if scale was my problem. Maybe I just needed small wood to work with the small acrylic. I wasn't sure. I decided to shift gears and go back to working with the window frame. I decided to disassemble the window frame into individual pieces of wood to better understand its construction. The process of taking it apart was actually pretty satisfying. Windows held together by 6 nails, 4 on the bottom, which were easy to remove. Exposure to water over the years had led to dry rot. The 2 on the top, however, were incredibly difficult. Both top nails required multiple clamps, pliers, hammers, and awls. Once I had 4 separate pieces, I took them into the studio to document them again. Looking at them under harsh lighting through a macro lens highlighted all the imperfections: the dry rot, the nail holes, the weathered wood grain, streaks of leftover paint. This reminded me of the conversation I'd had with my dad last week about the construction of the IKEA frame, specifically how the wood of the frame was constructed of many pieces, essentially upgrading the wood to remove any imperfections. I began to wonder what would happen if I applied the same logic to this window frame, that is, remove any imperfection from it in order to upgrade it. I started by trying to remove the remaining paint and weathered wood grain, first by hand, then with a saw, and finally a planer. Here I paused. Even though this wasn't what I had planned to do, the difference of old wood versus new wood was evident. I didn't want to ignore it and miss something bigger, so I decided to sit with this project for a few days. This weekend I also took a day trip to Locke. Locke is a 10-acre town in California's Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. It was originally built in 1915, constructed by and for Chinese immigrants. The buildings that I saw on Saturday were the same ones that were constructed over 100 years ago. The entire town was, in a sense, a time capsule. As I walked around, I couldn't help but think of my thesis, and notice how the themes I was exploring in my own work existed in this town. Some were obvious, like the juxtaposition between old and new wood, and some were more subtle, like the concept of a timestamp. These images are of 2 buildings in Locke. It was pointed out to me that all the plumbing was mounted to the exterior of the dwelling. This reminded me of this image I'd seen last week of Westwood, where a culvert pipe was being constructed of wood 2x4s. Both are examples of outdated infrastructure, possibly innovative for their time, but practices that have long since been replaced. Again, not sure where this is going, but I'm making a note of it and setting it aside. Over the weekend, I also visited a junk shop and picked up a few letters of wood type. I've been thinking of it since the second week, where we briefly discussed type and typesetting in relation to these collages. I didn't know how these linked in, other than that they were made of wood, but I picked them up regardless. Later, in an attempt to see your thesis work on SF MoMA's website, I came across your cut letter series. This one in particular stuck out to me and made me wonder how and if this idea could be translated physically with the wood type I had. With the help of my dad, I cut the letter into pieces. Originally, I thought I would stagger them and use a macro lens, similar to what I had done here with past form studio work. However, when I went back to the studio to photograph, it didn't translate like I thought it might. At first I spaced them out diagonally, then zoomed in, but nothing jumped out to me. I then laid them down flat, and this actually reminded me of another conversation I'd had with my dad earlier this week about how a log is cut to get both long grain and short grain. I played around briefly with this idea, treating the tight pieces as cut lumber. The concept was more interesting to me than the images themselves. The final part of this seems out of place with everything else right now, but I'm reporting on it nonetheless. In continuing to read up on lumber companies and the history of logging, I stumbled upon some connections this week that were oddly fascinating. The Red River Lumber Company was started in 1884 by Thomas Barlow Walker. In 1913, the Red River Lumber Company operated a company town and a sawmill at Westwood, California. In 1927, T.B. Walker founded the Walker Art Gallery, which then became the Walker Art Center in 1940. His great-granddaughter, Anne M. Hatch, currently sits on the board at CCA. I think I'm personally fascinated by these connections because these worlds have always felt very separate to me. To find that they're actually quite interconnected was surprising. The other bit of information that stuck with me was a passage about the history of the lumberjack. The work was difficult, dangerous, intermittent, low paying, and involved living in primitive conditions. However, the men built a traditional culture that celebrated strength, masculinity, confrontation with danger, and resistance to modernization. The last part was what stuck out the most: resistance to modernization. It made me reflect back on my own interests, projects, and preferences. I photographed these items, both passed down from my own great-grandfather. This is where a majority of my tools have come from, passed down from older generations. Right now I'm wondering if this idea, resistance to modernization, is part of a larger thread of this project and possibly my work in general. Which brings me to our last installment, Part 6, IKEA. I picked up this IKEA dresser over the weekend. It's advertised as solid pine and retailed for $40. Still made up of strips of wood, as opposed to solid pieces, this dresser does contain variations and imperfections, unlike the picture frame. In contrast to the other dated objects I've deconstructed this week, this one is bright and shiny. It contains instructions for assembly and could probably be built inside an hour. I have no idea whether I'm going to build it per the instructions or use it for something else completely, but the ease at which I can buy and build a dresser seems to have a place in this work. A quote from Brave New World has continued to pop into my head these past few weeks. Ending is better than mending. The quote, of course, is meant to emphasize the importance of consumption within the book's fictional society. But it also rings true for me when I think about the mass-marketed furniture at IKEA versus the objects that I'm more naturally drawn to work with.